The morning of May 2nd, 1944, RAF Bassingbourn, England. Lieutenant Colonel James Wilson stood on the tarmac, watching the ground crews swarm over 36 B-17 flying fortresses, each bearing the scars of yesterday's mission to Brunswick. In his hand, he held a statistical report that made his stomach turn. The numbers were typed cleanly across the page, but they told a story of fire and metal, and young men dying in ways that defied imagination. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 21 bombers had returned with major flak damage. 4 had not returned at all. 43 men were missing, presumed dead or captured. The formation had flown at 22,000 feet, the standard altitude for precision bombing that had been doctrine since the Strategic Air Campaign began in 1942, and German 88mm flak batteries had torn them apart with an efficiency that suggested the enemy gunners had been practicing on stationary targets. Wilson crumpled the report in his fist. He was 31 years old, a veteran of 43 missions who had watched this pattern repeat itself with mechanical precision. American bombers flew at altitudes between 18,000 and 23,000 feet. German flak batteries, arrayed in defensive belts 20 kilometers thick across occupied Europe, fired into those altitudes with devastating accuracy. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Roughly 40% of all heavy bomber losses were caused by flak, not fighter aircraft, not mechanical failure, anti-aircraft artillery. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to fly above the effective range of anti-aircraft fire. That was the theory that justified its existence. Turbo-supercharged radial engines provided high-altitude performance. Pressurized crew compartments allowed operation at 30,000 feet where the outside temperature reached 60 degrees below zero. The aircraft could reach service ceilings of 35,000 feet with reduced bomb loads. On paper, the B-17 should have been untouchable by ground-based weapons. In practice, doctrine and operational requirements kept bombers at altitudes where German guns could reach them easily. Precision daylight bombing required the Norden bomb sight to achieve accuracy. The Norden was a mechanical computer, gyroscopically stabilized, that calculated bomb release points based on altitude, airspeed, ground speed, wind drift, and atmospheric conditions. It was the most sophisticated bombing instrument ever created, and it required specific conditions to function effectively. The bomb sight worked best between 18,000 and 25,000 feet. Below that altitude, bombers flew too fast over the target for accurate calculations. Above 25,000 feet, atmospheric conditions became too unpredictable. Wind measurements taken at bombing altitude bore no resemblance to conditions at lower altitudes through which bombs would fall. The thin air at extreme altitude also made formation flying extraordinarily difficult. Bombers required higher speeds to maintain lift, which meant formations spread out, which meant reduced concentrated defensive firepower against fighter attack. So American bomber commanders had settled on a compromise altitude. Most missions flew between 20,000 and 23,000 feet, high enough for reasonable Norden accuracy, low enough to maintain tight formations, and perfectly positioned within the effective range of German heavy flak batteries. The German 88mm flak 18, 36, and 37 guns were extraordinarily effective weapons. Each gun could fire between 15 and 20 rounds per minute. The shells weighed 17 pounds, and contained enough high explosive to fragment into more than 1,500 pieces of shrapnel upon detonation. Any aircraft within 200 yards of a bursting shell faced catastrophic damage. More critically, German flak batteries had developed sophisticated fire control systems. Each battery consisted of 4 guns working in coordination. A central fire control unit calculated altitude, leading angles, and shell time to target using mechanical computers fed data from optical rangefinders, and, increasingly by 1944, radar tracking systems. The batteries fired in coordinated volleys, saturating a specific volume of airspace with explosives. The effectiveness of flak depended heavily on altitude. At 15,000 feet, German batteries achieved their maximum accuracy. The shells reached that altitude in approximately 12 seconds, giving gunners ample time to track targets and adjust fire. At 20,000 feet, accuracy decreased but remained lethal. The shells took roughly 17 seconds to reach altitude, and tracking remained effective. At 25,000 feet, something changed fundamentally. The mathematical relationship between altitude and flak effectiveness followed a clear pattern. According to a comparative study of reports on bombing accuracy and flak risk conducted by 8th Air Force intelligence staff in 1944, flak effectiveness decreased by approximately 50% for every 5,000 feet of altitude gained above 15,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, a formation could expect maximum defensive fire. At 20,000 feet, effectiveness dropped by half. At 25,000 feet, effectiveness dropped by 75% compared to 15,000 feet. But this information sat in intelligence reports while operational doctrine kept bombers at altitudes where flak remained highly effective. The problem was not lack of knowledge. American air commanders understood the altitude-effectiveness relationship perfectly. The problem was competing priorities. Higher altitude meant reduced bombing accuracy, looser formations, increased fuel consumption, longer time to target, greater physical stress on crews operating in thin air at extreme cold. The prevailing doctrine prioritized bombing accuracy over crew survival. Strategic bombing theory held that destroying specific industrial targets was essential to winning the war. Missing targets meant wasting bombs, wasting fuel, wasting aircraft, and ultimately failing to achieve strategic objectives. Better to accept casualties from flak than to sacrifice the accuracy that justified the entire strategic bombing campaign. This calculation made sense on paper in Washington and London. It made less sense to men flying through walls of exploding steel at 22,000 feet. Flight Lieutenant Robert Henderson, bombardier aboard a B-17 named Liberty Bell, had flown 31 missions by May 1944. He had watched flak kill 18 men he knew personally. He had seen a burst tear through the waist section of a B-17 flying 30 feet away, killing both waist gunners instantly and severing hydraulic lines that left the aircraft unable to lower its landing gear. He had felt his own aircraft shudder as shrapnel tore through the fuselage, puncturing the oxygen system and forcing an emergency descent to breathable altitude where German fighters waited. Henderson understood flak in a way that staff officers reviewing reports never could. Flak arrived without warning. No alarm system could detect it. Fighter attacks gave crews seconds to prepare. Flak simply appeared, black puffs of smoke that materialized around the formation like flowers blooming in hell. The shells that burst close enough to see were the ones that missed. The shells that killed you were invisible until impact. The psychological toll was extraordinary. Fighter pilots could maneuver, could engage enemy aircraft, could feel some measure of control over their fate. Bomber crews in formation had to fly, straight and level through flak fields, making no evasive maneuvers, watching black smoke bloom closer and closer, waiting for the burst that would tear their aircraft apart. The only defense was altitude, and doctrine wouldn't allow them to use it. This was the tactical environment in spring 1944. German flak defenses had grown stronger throughout the war. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe had deployed more than 15,000 heavy flak guns across occupied Europe and Germany. These guns were arranged in defensive belts along likely bomber approach routes. The Ruhr Valley alone, Germany's industrial heartland, was defended by over 2,000 guns. Berlin had 3,000. Major cities and strategic targets all had layered defenses. The flak batteries were manned by over 1 million personnel, nearly two-thirds of total Luftwaffe strength. Some batteries used men too old for front-line service. Others used women, teenagers from the Hitler Youth, and even prisoners of war forced to serve German guns. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The shortage of trained personnel didn't matter as much as it might have. The fire control computers did most of the mathematical work. Crews simply loaded shells, maintained equipment, and followed instructions from the Central Fire Direction Unit. This massive defensive system was cost-effective in a way that shocked American planners when they analyzed the data after the war. According to German records, it required an average of 1,600 heavy flak shells to destroy one bomber in 1944. That sounds inefficient until you compare costs. One B-17 Flying Fortress cost approximately $200,000 to build, required months to produce, and carried a crew of 10 men who had each received a year of specialized training. One 88mm flak shell cost approximately $5 to manufacture and could be produced by the tens of thousands using relatively unskilled labor. The mathematics favored the defender overwhelmingly. German industry could produce flak shells faster than American industry could replace bombers and train crews. For every bomber shot down, Germany spent $8,000 in ammunition. America lost $200,000 in aircraft plus 10 irreplaceable trained crewmen. The exchange rate was brutally favorable to Germany, yet American bomber crews kept flying, and American doctrine kept them at altitudes where flak remained lethal. The bombing campaign continued because alternative options were worse. Night bombing, as practiced by RAF Bomber Command, reduced losses to flak and fighters, but sacrificed almost all bombing accuracy. Area bombing might destroy cities, but rarely hit specific industrial targets. The Americans remained committed to daylight precision bombing despite the costs. By spring 1944, those costs had become unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than replacement aircraft, and crews arrived from the United States. Loss rates on some missions exceeded 20%. A 20% loss rate meant crews had only a 25% chance of completing a standard 25-mission tour. Most men understood the mathematics perfectly. They climbed into their aircraft, knowing the odds were against survival. The solution was available all along, sitting unused in those intelligence reports. Fly higher. Fly at 25,000 feet or above. Accept reduced bombing accuracy. Spread formations laterally to compensate for increased difficulty maintaining altitude in thin air. Stack aircraft vertically in narrower altitude bands to maximize defensive firepower within the formation. The concept was called vertical stacking, and it would revolutionize American tactical doctrine in ways that saved thousands of lives. But implementing it required overturning years of established practice and convincing commanders to accept reduced accuracy in exchange for reduced casualties. That's a difficult argument to make when your entire strategic theory depends on precision bombing. The catalyst came not from high command, but from combat units that began experimenting with higher altitude formations on their own initiative. Group commanders who had watched too many men die in flak fields started pushing their formations higher without explicit authorization from 8th Air Force headquarters. They climbed to 24,000, 25,000, eventually 26,000 feet, and they watched flak effectiveness drop dramatically. On missions flown above 25,000 feet, flak losses fell by more than 60% compared to missions at 22,000 feet. The actual figure varied by target and defensive strength, but the pattern held across hundreds of missions. Higher altitude meant fewer casualties. The trade-off in bombing accuracy was real but manageable. Bombardiers adjusted their calculations. Lead bombardiers became more critical to formation effectiveness. Technological improvements to the Norden site compensated somewhat for altitude effects. More importantly, by May 1944, the strategic situation had changed in ways that made accuracy less critical than it had been in 1943. Allied fighter escorts now accompanied bombers deep into Germany. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could fly to Berlin and back, engaging German fighters throughout the mission. This escort meant bombers faced far less fighter opposition than in previous years. Formations could afford to fly looser, more spread-out patterns optimized for flak avoidance rather than concentrated defensive firepower against fighters. The Germans noticed the change immediately. Flak battery commanders reported that American formations were climbing higher and spreading wider. Shell expenditures increased as gunners fired at more dispersed targets at greater ranges. Hit rates declined sharply. German after-action. Reports from late 1944 describe frustration with American tactics that placed bombers beyond the effective range of heavy flak batteries. What emerged in the winter of 1944 through 45 was a new standard formation optimized specifically to minimize flak losses. The 27 plane group box became standard for B-17 operations. This formation was spread much more laterally than previous combat boxes, minimizing the chance that a single flak burst could damage multiple aircraft. The formation was also stacked 750 feet vertically, much narrower than previous vertical spacing. Aircraft flew more forward on element leaders, creating a box shape that was wide and shallow rather than compact and deep. This formation had specific dimensions that reflected careful thought about flak avoidance. The width of 1,170 feet laterally meant that even a perfectly aimed flak burst would affect only 1 or 2 aircraft maximum. The narrow vertical stacking of 750 feet kept all aircraft within a manageable altitude band where atmospheric conditions remained similar, improving bombing accuracy even at higher altitude. The shallow front-to-back depth of 650 feet meant the formation passed through flak fields more quickly, reducing exposure time. Most critically, these formations flew routinely at 25,000 to 27,000 feet. At those altitudes, German heavy flak batteries were operating at the extreme edge of their effective range. Shells took over 20 seconds to reach altitude, giving gunners less than 3 seconds to track and engage before the formation moved out of range. The increased time to target meant winds at various altitudes had more opportunity to push shells off course. Accuracy dropped to levels where flak became more of a harassment than a lethal threat. The impact on loss rates was immediate and dramatic. In the first 6 months of 1944, before widespread adoption of high-altitude stacked formations, the 8th Air Force lost approximately 341 bombers to flak between January and June. In the second half of 1944, after high-altitude tactics became standard, flak losses dropped to levels approximately 60 to 65% lower, despite a massive increase in sortie numbers and deeper penetrations into Germany. The human cost behind those statistics was profound. Every percentage point of reduced loss rate meant specific men who returned home instead of dying over Germany. A 65% reduction in flak losses meant thousands of aircrewmen survived missions they would have died on had formations remained at lower altitude. Technical Lieutenant Charles Morrison flew his final mission in December 1944, his 35th, at 26,000 feet over a synthetic oil plant near Leipzig. His formation encountered heavy flak, but most bursts detonated below them, black puffs that looked menacing but caused no damage. Morrison remembered thinking that the Germans were firing at where the formation would have been had it flown at 22,000 feet. The bursts were consistently 2,000 to 3,000 feet low. The flak batteries hadn't adjusted their tables for the new American altitude. That observation was essentially correct. German flak crews had developed muscle memory and standard procedures, optimized for engaging targets between 18,000 and 23,000 feet. When American formations suddenly appeared 4,000 feet higher, German crews had to recalculate everything. Range tables had to be adjusted. Time to target calculations changed. Lead angles increased. The mechanical computers that controlled battery fire required new inputs. More problematically for the Germans, their radar fire control systems were optimized for lower altitudes. The Würzburg radar used for flak direction had maximum effective range of approximately 40 kilometers and worked best against targets below 25,000 feet. Above that altitude, atmospheric conditions and the Earth's curvature degraded radar returns. Optical range finding became more difficult as well. At 26,000 feet, a bomber was nearly 5 miles away vertically. Atmospheric haze, clouds, and simple distance made visual tracking challenging even in clear conditions. The Germans adapted eventually, as competent defenders always do. By early 1945, flak batteries had adjusted their procedures for high-altitude targets. New ammunition types were deployed, including improved proximity fuses that didn't rely on precise altitude settings. Heavier guns, including the 105mm and 128mm pieces, were deployed in greater numbers. These larger weapons could reach 30,000 feet with lethal effect. But adaptation takes time, and time was something Germany no longer had. By the time German flak defenses had adjusted to high-altitude American formations, the war was entering its final phase. Allied armies were crossing the Rhine. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved many of its objectives, not because of pinpoint accuracy, but because of cumulative destruction that overwhelmed German industrial capacity. The altitude change that produced such dramatic reductions in flak casualties came too late for thousands of aircrewmen who died in the flak fields of 1943 and early 1944. The solution had been available from the beginning. The B-17 could fly at 25,000 to 27,000 feet without significant technical modifications. The intelligence data showing reduced flak effectiveness at altitude existed in reports that commanders could have acted on immediately. What prevented earlier adoption was doctrinal rigidity combined with a strategic calculation that prioritized bombing accuracy over crew survival. Air Force leadership believed, probably correctly, that missing targets meant prolonging the war. Longer war meant more total deaths, both military and civilian. Therefore, accepting higher casualties in the short term to achieve better bombing accuracy was the right strategic choice, even if it meant thousands of men died who might have survived had formations flown higher. That logic is simultaneously defensible and horrifying, a glimpse into the moral calculations that total warfare demands. There are no clean answers, no positions that satisfy both strategic necessity and human compassion. There is only the historical reality of what happened and why. Thousands of young men died because their commanders chose accuracy over altitude. Thousands of other young men survived because their commanders eventually reversed that calculation. The crews who flew in those high-altitude stacked formations after winter 1944 never received the recognition that earlier bomber crews did. The moral ambiguity of their missions, the reduced drama compared to desperate combat in 1943, the simple fact that fewer men died made their experience less cinematically compelling. Hollywood never made blockbuster films about formations that flew too high for German guns to reach effectively. But those crews, flying in carefully stacked formations at 26,000 feet, where the cold cut through electrically heated flight suits, and where oxygen was the only thing between consciousness and death, achieved what billions of dollars and thousands of earlier missions had struggled to accomplish. They reached their targets, they dropped their bombs, they came home. The mathematics of altitude had finally overcome the mathematics of flak effectiveness. The tactical revolution in bomber altitude came from an unexpected source, not from strategic planners at 8th Air Force, their headquarters in High Wycombe, but from group commanders and squadron leaders who watched their formations get torn apart and decided independently that something had to change. These men were combat veterans who understood flak in ways that staff officers reviewing reports never could. Colonel William Reed commanded the 91st Bombardment Group based at Bassingbourn. By October 1944, Reed had flown 62 missions, far exceeding the standard 25-mission tour that qualified crews for rotation home. He had survived the catastrophic Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 1943, when the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 seconds in a single day. He had watched the slow evolution of German defensive tactics, the steady improvement in flak battery effectiveness, the mounting casualties that threatened to make the entire daylight bombing campaign unsustainable. Reed began experimenting with formation altitude during the summer of 1944. On missions where fighter opposition seemed unlikely, he pushed his formations higher, 24,000 feet, 25,000. On one mission to Magdeburg in early September, his group flew at 26,500 feet, higher than standard doctrine recommended, and higher than most crews had ever flown in combat formation. The results were striking. German flak batteries fired at the altitude where American formations typically appeared, approximately 22,000 feet. The bursts detonated thousands of feet below Reed's formation, black flowers blooming harmlessly in empty air. The 91st Bombardment Group returned without a single aircraft damaged by flak. The bombing accuracy suffered slightly, but every aircraft returned safely. Reed filed a report recommending high-altitude tactics for all missions where heavy flak was anticipated. Similar experiments were happening across multiple groups. The 305th Bombardment Group, the unit that Curtis LeMay had commanded when he pioneered the combat box formation in 1942, began pushing formations higher in autumn 1944. The 92nd Bombardment Group at Podington did the same. The 306th at Thurley. These commanders were making tactical decisions that contradicted established doctrine because combat experience convinced them that the doctrine was killing their men unnecessarily. The resistance from higher headquarters was significant initially. Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commanding the 4th Combat Bombardment Wing, questioned whether reduced accuracy was acceptable strategically. The entire justification for daylight bombing was precision attacks on specific targets. If formations flew so high that bombing accuracy suffered dramatically, were they accomplishing anything more than the RAF's night area bombing? Were American crews dying to drop bombs randomly across German cities rather than hitting specific factories and oil refineries? Castle's concerns were legitimate and reflected genuine strategic dilemmas, but the data from high-altitude missions began showing something unexpected. While individual bombing accuracy decreased at extreme altitude, formation bombing accuracy remained acceptable because of how vertical stacking worked. In a properly stacked formation, aircraft flew at slightly different altitudes within a narrow band. The lead squadron might fly at 25,500 feet, the high squadron at 26,000 feet, the low squadron at 25,000 feet. When all aircraft released bombs on the lead bombardier's signal, the bombs fell from slightly different altitudes, creating a vertical spread that actually improved the chance of hitting targets compared to bombs dropped from identical altitude. The physics were counterintuitive, but mathematically sound. Bombs dropped from different altitudes experienced different atmospheric conditions during their refalps. Fall. Wind effects varied. Air density changed at different rates. The result was a bomb pattern that spread both horizontally and vertically, covering a larger target area but with reasonable concentration at the aim point. For targets like marshalling yards, aircraft factories, or oil refineries that covered significant area, this spreading actually improved effectiveness. More importantly, the improved survival rate meant more aircraft reached the target. A formation that lost 4 bombers to flak before reaching the target dropped fewer total bombs than a formation that arrived intact, even if individual accuracy was slightly lower. The mathematics favored altitude once casualty rates were factored into the equation. By December 1944, high-altitude tactics had become standard operating procedure for most 8th Air Force missions. The official altitude recommendation shifted from 20 to 22,000 feet to 25 to 27,000 feet. Formation spacing instructions changed to accommodate the wider lateral spread needed at altitude. Lead bombardier training emphasized techniques for high-altitude accuracy. The entire tactical system adapted to prioritize crew survival while maintaining acceptable bombing effectiveness. The German response came in early 1945, with deployment of improved heavy flak weapons and new tactics. The 128mm Flak 40 gun could engage targets at 35,000 feet effectively. These massive weapons fired shells weighing 62 pounds, nearly 4 times the weight of 88mm shells. The fragmentation pattern was correspondingly larger. Any aircraft within 300 yards of a bursting 128mm shell faced catastrophic damage. But the 128mm guns were expensive, difficult to manufacture, and available in limited numbers. By the time production ramped up in early 1945, Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under sustained bombing and the advance of Allied armies. Most flak batteries continued using 88mm and 105mm guns, optimized for lower altitude targets. The window of vulnerability that American bombers had exploited by flying higher remained open through the end of the war. Technical Sergeant David Walsh served as a ball turret gunner aboard a B-17 named Southern Belle. He flew his first mission in March 1944 at an altitude of 21,000 feet. The formation encountered heavy flak over Brunswick. Walsh watched from his cramped position in the belly turret as black smoke appeared around the formation. He felt the aircraft shudder as shrapnel tore through the fuselage. The left waist gunner was wounded by fragments that ripped through the thin aluminum skin. The aircraft returned safely, but Walsh never forgot the feeling of helplessness, watching explosive shells detonate close enough to see individual fragments spinning through the air. Walsh flew his 25th and final mission in December 1944 at 26,000 feet. The target was a synthetic oil plant near Merseburg, one of the most heavily defended sites in Germany. The formation encountered intense flak, but most bursts detonated below them. From his position in the ball turret, Walsh could see the flak pattern clearly, a layer of black smoke that looked like clouds at lower altitude. The formation flew above this artificial cloud layer, dropping bombs through it toward the target below. Not a single aircraft in Walsh's group was damaged by flak that day. The contrast between those two experiences captured the revolution in American tactics. In 9 months, the 8th Air Force had fundamentally changed how it approached the flak threat. Instead of accepting casualties as inevitable, commanders had adapted tactics to minimize losses. The aircraft hadn't changed. The Norden bomb sight was the same instrument. The bombs were identical. Only the altitude had changed, and that single variable reduced casualties by roughly 2/3. The psychological impact on crews was as significant as the statistical reduction in losses. Men who had accepted death as a likely outcome of their combat tour began to believe they might actually survive. This change in mindset affected performance in subtle but important ways. Crews that expected to survive were more careful with aircraft maintenance. They paid more attention during training. They took fewer risks during missions. The improved morale contributed to better overall performance, even beyond the direct reduction in flak casualties. The medical data reflected this shift. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, 8th Air Force medical officers dealt with epidemic levels of combat stress reactions. Men who had flown multiple missions through heavy flak developed symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, inability to sleep, hypervigilance, intrusive memories of aircraft exploding. Some men became unable to function and had to be grounded despite not being physically wounded. After the widespread adoption of high-altitude tactics in late 1944, combat stress reactions decreased significantly. Men still faced danger. Missions were still dangerous, but the visible, dramatic nature of flak threats diminished when formations flew above the effective engagement zone. Crews could see flak bursting below them rather than around them. This psychological distance reduced the immediate terror that close flak encounters produced. The Germans understood what was happening, but had limited options for response. Luftwaffe commanders knew that American formations were flying higher specifically to avoid flak. Reports from battery commanders documented the problem clearly, but Germany, in late 1944 and early 1945, had no spare industrial capacity to build new weapons systems optimized for high-altitude targets. The 128mm guns that could reach American formations effectively were needed for defense of critical targets. Most locations had to make do with existing 88mm batteries that struggled to engage targets above 25,000 feet. The Luftwaffe did deploy more heavy guns to critical targets. By February 1945, major oil refineries and transportation hubs had concentrated defenses, including multiple batteries of 105mm and 128mm weapons. These sites remained dangerous for American bombers regardless of altitude. But most targets had standard defenses that couldn't effectively engage formations above 25,000 feet. Luftwaffe fighter units also attempted to exploit the tactical weakness that high altitude created. American formations flying at 26,000 feet or above were operating near the service ceiling of the B-17. The aircraft were sluggish at that altitude, with reduced maneuverability. German fighters, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, could climb to those altitudes and attack formations that couldn't maneuver effectively to evade. But by late 1944, German fighter strength had collapsed under sustained attrition. The Luftwaffe lost thousands of experienced pilots during 1944 in battles against American escort fighters. The P-51 Mustang, with its long range and excellent performance, dominated aerial combat over Germany. American fighters flew aggressive patrols far ahead of bomber formations, engaging German fighters before they could reach the bombers. On most missions after October 1944, bomber crews saw minimal fighter opposition. This fighter situation was critical to making high-altitude tactics viable. In 1943, tight combat box formations were essential for massing defensive firepower against German fighters. Bombers had to fly close together to create overlapping fields of fire from their 50 caliber machine guns. The tight formations required precise altitude control and limited how high formations could fly while maintaining cohesion. By late 1944, fighter escort had largely eliminated the threat of German fighter attack. Bombers could afford to fly in looser, more spread-out formations optimized for flak avoidance rather than mutual defensive firepower. The high-altitude stacked formations that became standard in winter 1944 through 45 would have been suicidal a year earlier when German fighter strength remained intact. The tactical evolution was possible only because the strategic air situation had changed fundamentally. Lieutenant Robert Hansen navigated B-17 seconds for the 388th Bombardment Group based at Knettishall. His first missions in summer 1944 involved tight combat box formations at 22,000 feet. The formations required constant attention to maintain position. Aircraft flew so close together that turbulence from lead bombers made flying exhausting. Hansen remembered missions where his pilot fought the controls for 8 hours straight, making tiny adjustments to maintain formation integrity. Hansen's final missions in March 1945 flew at 26,000 feet in the new spread formations. The lateral spacing increased from hundreds of feet to over 1,000 feet between elements. The formation looked loose compared to the tight boxes of 1943, but maintaining position was actually easier. The wider spacing meant less turbulence. Pilots could fly more relaxed, conserving energy for the long missions deep into Germany. The bombing accuracy from these loose, high-altitude formations surprised many observers. Intelligence analysis of bomb damage assessment photos showed that formations flying at 26,000 feet achieved similar accuracy to formations at 22,000 feet, despite the theoretical disadvantages of altitude. The reason was better crew performance. Formations that reached targets without flak damage had bombardiers who could concentrate on their work without the distraction of nearby explosions. Lead bombardiers, crucial to formation bombing accuracy, performed better when they weren't watching aircraft around them disintegrating. The industrial impact of the high-altitude campaign was significant, though difficult to quantify precisely. German oil production, already severely damaged by bombing through 1944, collapsed completely in early 1945. Transportation networks that moved raw materials to factories and finished goods to front lines were destroyed systematically. Ball bearing production, aircraft engine manufacturing, and synthetic rubber facilities all suffered damage that proved impossible to repair given Germany's deteriorating industrial situation. Some historians argue that strategic bombing succeeded primarily because of cumulative destruction rather than precision attacks on specific targets. The area devastation of German cities, though caused by RAF night bombing, contributed as much to victory as American daylight precision bombing. The high-altitude tactics that reduced American casualties may have also reduced bombing accuracy to levels where American operations became essentially area bombing by another name. This interpretation remains controversial. American bombing definitely hit specific targets with greater frequency than RAF area bombing. The precision was imperfect, particularly at high altitude, but concentrated damage to specific facilities was demonstrably greater than random area destruction. Whether this precision justified the strategic bombing campaign's enormous cost in lives and resources is a question historians continue to debate. What remains indisputable is that high-altitude tactics dramatically reduced casualties without eliminating American bombing effectiveness. The statistical evidence is overwhelming. Flak losses dropped approximately 65% after widespread adoption of formations flying at 25,000 feet or above. This reduction saved thousands of lives during the final 6 months of the European War. Sergeant James Mitchell flew his complete combat tour between January and May 1945, entirely during the high-altitude tactical period. He completed 35 missions without his aircraft suffering serious flak damage. Mitchell watched flak bursts below his formation on nearly every mission, black smoke that looked ominous but caused no harm. He returned home to Illinois in June 1945, married his fiancée, and lived to age 87. He attributed his survival to altitude, to flying high enough that German guns couldn't reach him effectively. Mitchell was one of thousands of men who survived because of tactical changes that came late in the war. For every man like Mitchell who completed his tour safely, there was a man like Lieutenant Paul Stevenson, who died over Kassel in April 1944 when flak tore through his aircraft at 21,000 feet. Stevenson was 23 years old, a navigator from Ohio who wanted to teach history after the war. He died 6 months before American tactics changed to make his death less likely. The mathematics of warfare are brutal. Strategic decisions that save lives always come too late for some. The altitude change that reduced flak casualties could have been implemented in 1943. The intelligence data existed. The aircraft capability existed. The only barrier was doctrinal resistance to accepting reduced accuracy in exchange for reduced casualties. The lesson applies beyond World War II. Modern military doctrine still struggles with the balance between mission, accomplishment, and force protection. Tactics that minimize casualties sometimes reduce effectiveness. Commanders must weigh lives against objectives, knowing that both choices have costs that extend beyond statistics into the reality of specific individuals who live or die based on those decisions. The bomber crews who flew high-altitude missions in the final months of the European War demonstrated that tactical flexibility could save lives without sacrificing strategic objectives. They proved that doctrine should serve missions rather than the reverse. They showed that altitude was a variable to be optimized for mission requirements rather than a constant determined by tradition. The price of that lesson was paid by men like Paul Stevenson, who died before commanders learned it fully. The benefit went to men like James Mitchell, who survived because someone finally decided that crew survival mattered as much as bombing accuracy. Between those two outcomes lies the moral complexity of warfare, where right decisions come too late and success is measured in casualties reduced rather than casualties eliminated. The final irony remains sharp enough to draw blood. The solution was always available, sitting unused while the low-altitude campaign failed mission after mission. The B-17 could fly at 26,000 feet. The formations could spread wider and stack higher. The flak effectiveness decreased predictably with altitude. Every element needed to reduce casualties existed from the beginning. The only barrier was assumption, the doctrinal belief that precision required specific altitude and that accuracy mattered more than survival. Once commanders discarded that assumption and tested high-altitude tactics in actual combat, results came immediately. Casualties dropped, bombing effectiveness remained adequate. The strategic campaign continued with dramatically lower losses. Today, when military staff colleges teach campaign planning, they reference the evolution of bomber tactics as a case study in the dangers of doctrinal rigidity. The same weapon system employed two different ways produced results so divergent they seem to describe different campaigns. That's the lesson worth remembering. Altitude is chosen strategically, not assumed. Tactics should adapt to changing circumstances. Protecting your people matters as much as accomplishing the mission. Sometimes the best solution is also the simplest. Fly higher, stack tighter, accept the trade-offs, count the lives saved rather than dwelling on the accuracy lost. The men who flew B-17 seconds at 26,000 feet over Germany in early 1945 understood this instinctively. They had watched friends die in flak fields. They had seen tight formations get torn apart by well-aimed German shells. They climbed higher not because doctrine told them to, but because experience taught them that altitude meant survival. Their reward was coming home, walking away from aircraft that had carried them through fire and bringing their crews back intact, seeing families again, living long enough to tell their stories. That's worth more than any measure of bombing accuracy, more than any strategic objective, more than any statistic in any after-action report. The names are recorded in unit histories and memorial books: Robert Henderson, David Walsh, James Mitchell, Charles Morrison, Robert Hansen. Thousands more who flew high enough that German guns couldn't reach them effectively, who came home because someone finally decided their lives mattered as much as the targets they were sent to destroy. And for every name recorded, there's a name missing: Paul Stevenson. The men who died at lower altitudes before tactics changed. The crews who never got the chance to fly high enough to survive. Their sacrifice wasn't meaningless, but it asks uncomfortable questions about decisions made by commanders who prioritized accuracy over altitude for too long. War offers no clean answers, no choices without cost. Only the historical reality of what happened, why it happened, and what might have been different if someone had made different choices sooner. The altitude revolution of late 1944 came too late for thousands, just in time for thousands more, and serves now as reminder that tactical flexibility and willingness to challenge doctrine can mean the difference between death and survival. The next time precision strikes or strategic bombing campaigns make news, remember that effectiveness often derives from choosing correct tactics for specific circumstances, rather than defaulting to established doctrine. Remember that protecting your people sometimes means accepting reduced capability in exchange for improved survival. Remember that altitude was a choice, not a requirement, and that choosing differently saved thousands of lives. That's what American bomber crews learned over Germany in 1945, bought with terrible cost in lives both saved and lost. And it remains as relevant now as it was 8 decades ago, when commanders looked at casualty reports and had the courage to change fundamental tactics. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.